Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panel. The Mueller Report highlights the counterintelligence risk posed by financial leverage that the Russians may have had over individuals, a variety of individuals close to President Trump, especially Paul Manafort. The report explains that, quote, Manafort had connections to Russia through his prior work for Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska and later through his work for a pro-Russian regime in Ukraine. Manafort stayed in touch with these contacts during the campaign period through Konstantin Kilimnik, a longtime Manafort employee who previously ran Manafort's office in Kiev and who the FBI assesses to have ties to Russian intelligence. We also know from reporting that Manafort owed Deripaska substantial sums of money. Many of Manafort's contacts with Kremlin-aligned actors took place while he was chairman of Donald Trump's campaign. Among other things, Manafort, quote, instructed Rick Gates, his deputy on the campaign and a longtime employee, to provide Kilimnik with updates on the Trump campaign, including internal polling data. It appears that Manafort believed that by sharing confidential campaign information with Deripaska, one of Putin's most loyal oligarchs, he could resolve their, quote, disagreement originating from several lawsuits filed by Deripaska against Manafort. The ranking member's opening comments that the contacts with Russia were ordinary, notwithstanding, and Mr. McCarthy, with due respect to your many decades of service to this country, that is not what campaigns do. Sharing internal polling data with a hostile foreign power is not what campaigns do. I'm willing to bet you or anybody else my next paycheck that not a single member of the United States Congress, the 535 of us, ever asked our campaign managers to share our internal polling data with a hostile foreign power. So, Mr. Anderson, let me start with you. How could the Kremlin or its intelligence services try to exploit Manafort's longstanding business and personal relationship with Konstantin Kilimnik, who the FBI assesses to have ties to Russian intelligence and to Deripaska? How could they use that relationship? What counterintelligence risks are posed by such a relationship with a presidential campaign?
Well, there's a lot, sir. One, obviously, they would exploit, if they did have financial leverage on that individual, they would exploit every aspect of that. The one thing I will tell you about Russian intelligence services is if you read a book from 1940, they're the same. They are a in-your-face, not a very polite bunch of people that will use any means possible once they've locked on into an individual that they deem necessary to get to whatever end they're going after. So not only would they exploit financial information from Mr. Manafort or anybody else that they could, but they would also use that then to look at individuals around those financial transactions. So in other words, not only going directly at Mr. Manafort, but potentially going at individuals around those financial transactions that if for some reason that did not work against him, they would look at other avenues to get towards that.
Thank you. Ms. Douglas, let me ask you a variant of that question. How could Russia's knowledge of Manafort's illicit dealings, for which he is now a tenant of the United States government, which stem from his work with pro-Kremlin parties in Ukraine, be useful as compromat or compromising material as the Russian government undertook a covert influence effort directed at the U.S. public? How could the Russians use what they knew about Paul Manafort to their advantage?
Well, I think they did it very effectively. And one of the ways they did it that it's immediately apparent is they actually tasked him. And that's one of the initial tests when you are developing an asset for intelligence collection.
Can you elaborate on that? You just said that the Russians tasked the campaign chairman of Donald Trump's campaign. Can you just elaborate on how the Russians tasked him?
They asked him to provide polling data. And like you said, I mean, polling data isn't the keys to the kingdom, right? But it is a small step that illustrates his willingness to provide information to someone he knows he's beholden to financially, right? An ongoing lawsuit, fees that are owed, and he is willing to provide internal campaign information to a foreign government and to a person who was closely tied to the Kremlin. And I think that is a great illustration of how the Russians work. And Paul Manafort was very, very forward-leaning on volunteering all of his his abilities, his experience, his connections. He made all that available in addition. But I thought that that was very interesting, that they are tasking him and building upon that. And if he would have stayed with the campaign, I am sure they would have continued to task him.
Thank you. I'm out of time, so I'll yield back the balance of my time.